Battle of Kyiv. The Battle of Kyiv was one of the biggest fights at the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia tried to take Ukraine's capital in a fast-moving assault, but ran into way more resistance than expected. Russia sent in 40,000 to 60,000 troops with tanks, artillery, air support, and special forces, while Ukraine had about 20,000 to 25,000 fighters, including soldiers, National Guard, and volunteers, armed with drones and Western-supplied anti-tank weapons. On February 24th, Russian airborne troops landed at Hostomel Airport, hoping to secure a way into Kyiv. But Ukraine hit back hard, destroying planes and forcing brutal ground combat. Meanwhile, Russian troops pushed in from Belarus, advancing through Bucha, Irpin, and Brovary, but got bogged down by Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian forces used Javelin and NLAW missiles to ambush Russian convoys, while Bayraktar TB2 drones took out Russian tanks. On top of that, Russia ran into major supply issues, with troops running out of fuel and food. By late March, after weeks of failed attacks, Russia had no choice but to retreat. On April 2, 2022, Ukraine fully reclaimed the area, scoring a massive victory. Battle of Mariupol. The Battle of Mariupol was one of the toughest and longest fights of the Russia-Ukraine war. Russian forces laid siege to the city for nearly 3 months, throwing in about 14,000 troops, regular soldiers, Chechen fighters, Wagner mercenaries, and separatists, backed by airstrikes and artillery. On the other side, around 3,500 to 8,100 Ukrainian soldiers, mostly from the Azov Regiment, the 36th Marine Brigade, and the National Guard, fought back with drones, anti-tank weapons, and underground bunkers. From February 24th, Russian and separatist forces quickly surrounded Mariupol. By early March, they had cut off food and water, turning the city into a battlefield. Despite being outnumbered, Ukrainian forces turned Mariupol into a hard challenge for the Russians, using buildings and tunnels for surprise attacks. Russia hit back with bombings, including the Mariupol Drama Theater attack on March 16th. By April, Ukrainian troops were pushed back to the Azovstal steel plant, a huge industrial complex with underground bunkers. Russian forces kept hammering them with airstrikes and ground assaults, but they held out for weeks. Finally, on May 20th, the last Ukrainian soldiers surrendered. The fall of Mariupol was a big win for Russia, giving them a key port and a direct land route to Crimea. Battle of Severodonetsk. The Battle of Severodonetsk was one of the toughest fights of the Russia-Ukraine war, with Russian forces battling for nearly 2 months to take the city. On May 6th, Russian and separatist troops launched a full-scale attack on Severodonetsk, a key city in Luhansk Oblast. What followed was brutal street-by-street combat, as Ukrainian soldiers used the city's buildings and infrastructure to hold off the assault despite facing constant shelling. By early June, Russian forces had taken most of the city, but Ukrainian troops kept fighting in the industrial areas. After weeks of intense clashes, the city finally fell on June 25th, making it Russia's biggest win since taking Mariupol and giving them a strong foothold in the Donbass. Both sides suffered heavy losses, though exact numbers are unknown. Taking Severodonetsk gave Russian forces a path to push deeper into the Donbass, ramping up the war in eastern Ukraine. Battle of Lysychansk. The Battle of Lysychansk was a major fight in the Russia-Ukraine war, marking the final push for Russia to take over Luhansk Oblast. After Severodonetsk fell, Lysychansk was the last big city in the region still under Ukrainian control. Russian and separatist forces, led by commanders like Alexander Lapin and Sergei Surovikin, launched a massive assault with heavy artillery and airstrikes. At first, Ukrainian troops held their ground, using anti-tank weapons, and even getting help from Belarusian volunteers. But by late June, Russian forces had made big gains, hitting key spots like the LYSYCHANSK oil refinery and nearby villages. By July 2nd, reports said Russian troops had surrounded the city, leading to brutal street fighting. With the risk of being completely cut off, Ukrainian forces decided to retreat to avoid heavy losses. On July 3rd, Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, announced they had fully taken Lysychansk, which Ukraine later confirmed. This gave Russia and its allies full control of Luhansk Oblast, achieving one of their biggest goals in the east. Battle of AVDIIVKA. The Battle of AVDIIVKA has been one of the longest and most brutal fights of the Russia-Ukraine war, with Russian forces constantly trying to take the city. From the start of the war in February 2022, AVDIIVKA became a major target because of its strategic importance. Ukrainian troops, mainly from the 25th Airborne Brigade, defended the city, while the 56th Motorized Infantry Brigade held the southern areas. Russia kicked off its assault with heavy shelling, hitting the AVDIIVKA coke plant on March 13, 2022. More attacks followed, including strikes with Tornado-S rockets. By March 23rd, Russian troops had taken Verkhnotretsk, and from late March into April, the city was under non-stop artillery fire. Both sides suffered heavy losses, though the exact numbers aren't clear. Battle of Bakhmut. The Battle of Bakhmut was one of the longest and bloodiest fights of the Russia-Ukraine war, turning into a brutal urban meat grinder with massive casualties on both sides. Wagner, a private military force linked to the Kremlin, led the charge, sending them in wave after wave to wear down Ukrainian soldiers. On the Ukrainian side, multiple brigades, including mechanized units, territorial defense forces, and special ops troops, turned Bakhmut into a fortress. The battle quickly turned into a grinding war of attrition. Russia relied on constant shelling and direct assaults, while Ukraine ambushed Russian troops, used drones, and launched precision strikes to slow them down. After nearly 10 months of non-stop fighting, Russian forces finally captured Bakhmut in May 2023. But the so-called victory came at a huge cost. Russia had burned through thousands of troops and a massive amount of equipment to take a city that was completely destroyed. Battle of CHASIV Yar. The Battle of CHASIV Yar, which started on April 4, 2024, is still raging in 2025 and has turned into one of the bloodiest, most important fights of the Russia-Ukraine war. The city, sitting on high ground in Donetsk Oblast, became a top Russian target because of its position near key Ukrainian strongholds. Russia threw everything at the city. Some of the key Russian units involved included the 51st, 3rd, and 8th Combined Arms, as well as Russian Airborne Forces, National Guard units, and BAKHMUT Spetsnaz. On the Ukrainian side, troops from brigades like the 92nd Assault Brigade, 67th Mechanized Brigade, and 5th Assault Brigade dug in hard. Elite units like the Kraken Regiment, Luhansk Assault Regiment, and the International Legion also played a big role in slowing down Russia's advance. By February 2025, Russia had taken control of most of the city, marking a huge breakthrough. If CHASIV Yar falls completely, it'll give Russia a big advantage, letting them push deeper into Donetsk Oblast and mess with Ukrainian supply lines. KHERSON counteroffensive. The KHERSON counteroffensive was a huge win for Ukraine, forcing Russia to abandon the only regional capital it had taken. Ukrainian forces hammered Russian supply lines with HIMARS, cutting off thousands of troops west of the Dnipro River. With no way to hold the city, Russia pulled out and Ukraine took back Kherson on November 11th after 8 months.